Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative of Cleveland, we welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, we'd like to share a bit about the CTSC. The Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative of Cleveland is a collaborative among Case Western Reserve University and its affiliated hospital systems. The Cleveland Clinic, Metro Health, University Hospitals, and the Louis Stokes Veterans Administration Medical Center. We aspire to be a catalyst for high-quality clinical and translational research, both locally and nationally, by changing the culture and environment of biomedical research, sharing resources and expertise, and streamlining the research process to move translational research from bench to bedside and to the community. Our speaker today, Ivanka Hall, is the Executive Director of the nationally recognized Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition. She received a Master of Public Administration from Texas Southern University and a Bachelor of Arts from Notre Dame College. She is a proud graduate of John Marshall High School in Cleveland, Ohio, and a 2019 inductee into the Alumni Hall of Fame. The Cleveland Plain Dealer named her the homegrown hero for her work addressing food insecurity. The 1974 murder of her mother, Yvonne Boston Hall, dramatically changed her life. Her childhood promise to use her life to help others has led to the creation of cutting-edge programs and impacted thousands of people's lives. She was recently named a 100 Women to Know in America, and she recently executive produced a documentary about COVID in the African American community titled Black COVID, the Rona. She is a mother, grandmother, and activist deeply impassioned and involved in social justice activities locally and nationally. Her efforts will save many children from the lifelong impact of lead poisoning. Her work is designed to address equity issues in the community and highlight the need for policy and cause to declare racism a public health crisis. She was honored as a Black Green Woman in 2021. She was recently appointed to serve on the National Environmental Protection Agency National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and she is a board member serving on numerous local and national organizations. She is a nationally recognized congressional award-winning health disparities expert. She speaks all over the country about effectively engaging the African American community and about the art of community engagement. She is an activist, leader, influencer, humanitarian, speaker, researcher, and philanthropist. Dr. Hall, the floor is yours to begin your presentation, and then we'll start the Q&A portion of your session.
Greetings. I am sorry that I was racing in here. So I was scheduled to do a presentation with the Hispanic Latino community this morning, and I thought it was virtual. Because they sent me a link, and then after they sent the link, they called and said, oh, for some reason it's showing up as a virtual meeting, but it's actually in person. So I had to race from here to the other side of town in order for me to be over there for their meeting. And so thank you all for being kind and understanding for me in this little dilemma that I was in today. I am going to, hopefully everybody can hear me. I see that I am spotlighted now, so now you can see me. And I actually put on regular clothes for today. But I try to now, since we are supposedly out of the pandemic. So I'm going to share a screen and pull up this presentation that I have worked on for you guys. Let's see. I think you all can see it now. Okay, so basically I was trying to think of like, what are some of the words that would kind of describe the work that we do and the work that I do in my team in regards to research. And so for us, it is racism research, resilience, and restitution. And so for us, looking at those pieces and why they are important to the community. I know that I was supposed to do 4 slides, but there are probably a couple more than 4 slides. And so the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, the importance of our work is that we were created to create equity in the African American community, addressing the cumulative impact of racial, economic, environmental, and social justice inequities in education, employment, housing, and health by working to educate, advocate for, and empower the community. That's vitally important because for us, that is our work. That is our everyday work. Like, we get a lot of organizations that have these missions, and then all of a sudden they're like all over the place, and you're like, well, what does that actually have to do with what you're here for? And so for us, the bigger part of this research question is this whole thing around race and racism. We know that originally race was related to your language that you spoke. And so race was, the divide was around what language did you speak. And then with Chantel's slavery, what we saw was this whole thing around physical traits. So how to put people on a caste system, and put Black and brown people always at the bottom of this caste system. And so this looking at racism as a belief that a race is a fundamental determinant of human and human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. That is, one of the things that's important, and it's important to research, because a lot of times we always want to disassociate and say, well, we really don't look at, we don't look at race. But when we look at research, and what research has done communities, is that we don't always look at this whole African American experience in the United States. So this time between 1619 and 1865 accounts for about 82% of the experience for African Americans here in the United States. And so when we talk about research and the things that have, the historical pieces that have happened to African Americans, we have to make sure that we're understanding this 82%. And that this time since 1865 encompasses about 18% of the experience here in the United States. But when we get to research, for many of our communities that we're seeking to work with, although they may not know all of the details about the disparities around research and the impact around racism, we have to understand the role of slave medicine, not only that it played in past communities, but what role it is still playing now. So understanding the role around Dr. Marion Sims and his whole thing around creating these gynecological experiments with enslaved African women, and not allowing them to have anesthesia, and then looking at them as inhumane. And then how that has been translated down through our research in medical institutions, as looking at Black communities members as being able to take more pain and not needing anesthesia. And so looking at that whole history around research and racism, the Tuskegee experiment, which, African Americans, it was an experiment. So no matter whether we want to call it a study, and so in some groups they call it a study, but in my particular instance, I call it an experiment, because what happened was people were denied a drug that was available to them, penicillin, even after it was available, for some 40 years. So this went on from the 30s until 1972, and it was not apologized to the community into the Clinton administration. And so when the Clinton administration finally decided to say, okay, we need to right some of these past wrongs. And so when we're talking about research, it's important for us to understand that although our communities that we're seeking to engage may not understand all of the ebbs and flows around research, they understand what they have read and what they've heard. And then Henrietta Lacks. So this whole thing around HeLa cells, where a Black woman went into the doctor's office and said, I'm not feeling well. They removed some cells, and then figured out that those cells actually replicate, which, very few people's cells are able to continue to grow and replicate. And those cells are still being used to this day, and that they have generated billions of dollars in scientific research, with a family that is still not compensated. And up until recently, did not even know that the cells had been used from their mom. And so we have to talk about, what it means for people who are taking parts in studies, why it's important for them to understand what's going on. And then for me, understanding that these two periods, when we're talking about research and African Americans, and how around health and wellness, understanding that we have two periods of time in history where African American health status improved. And it didn't improve because of research, it improved because of policy change. And so the policy change was the Freedmen's Bureau was established as part of the post-Reconstruction era. The Freedmen's Bureau was from 1865 to 1872. What it did was it established Black medical schools, hospitals, and clinics throughout the South. This inevitably saved the African American community from extinction. Why those medical schools were important then and why they're important now is because we have to have a way to build trust within those communities. One of the things that's very important to research is this whole trust factor. And so when people are working with communities, it's important for communities to have folks within these research studies that are heading these studies and leading studies that look like them. It is important for those communities to work with these Black medical schools, hospitals, and clinics. The other thing is that these things, save the African American community from extinction, because what we expected is that we were sent off of these plantations with no resources, many inadequate clothing for weather change, food, housing, and that the whole link was that the African American community would walk off of these plantations and they would die. And we would not have to deal with this African American issue or problem any longer in the United States. And what happened is, because of resilience, which is part of the presentation, we lived. This other thing around resilience is, around health status, is that the civil rights movement was also the time when we saw some change around health conditions for African Americans. So that time between 1965, 1975, what it did was it outlawed racial discrimination in government funding health programs. It provided Medicaid and Medicare, and then it ended this whole thing around hospital desegregation. Now, one of the things that's important for us to remember in research currently is that we're starting to see segregated hospital systems again. Hospital systems where we see very few African Americans that are inpatient, physicians, research folks that are working within those hospitals. And so we're looking at hospital systems that have to do everything in their power in order for them to not change back to what they once were. And so for those communities that we want to serve in this whole scientific realm, we have to understand what role the desegregation of hospitals played, because it allowed for the integration of staff and patients, which changed the quality of patient care. And so we have to understand, what role that is. In research, we often work with community and neighborhood health centers, and that's usually because that's where community members go for their care. It is important for us to know that these health centers started as a direct result of the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act, because those health centers were places that were in the community that had all Black staff. So their administrators were Black, their nurses were Black, the people who worked on them in whether they went to for lab work also looked like those communities. And so looking like those communities and understanding the dynamics that were playing out in that community has been vitally important to our health centers. And so if you look at the time when health centers came to be, we still have some health centers that are still here that are now federally qualified health centers, like Neon, which was part of that. That came as a direct result of that Civil Rights Act. So Neon was one of the health centers that came with that. Between 1975 and post-Civil Rights Movement, gains have been halted dramatically. And so in our research, we have to make sure that we're looking at and understanding this whole historical context around racism and what it has played in our community. And then the whole resilience of the community as being able to build upon even after gains were lost, okay? Since 1980, we have a big decline in the health status of African Americans. What we have attributed to is busing. School busing changed our neighborhoods completely, because African Americans that could afford to move from neighborhoods moved. So we saw not only white flight from urban areas, but we saw Black flight as well. So upwardly mobile African Americans moved from those communities. And so their base And so we have a lot of African Americans that work in academia and work in other things who may not have connections to the community any longer. And then we're saying, oh, well, you know these people because these are your folks. And, and they really don't, because they have not had a tie to those communities since the 1980s. We also saw this war on drugs that just decimated the African American community, and the closure of mental health facilities. African Americans are usually less likely to receive mental health care. About 20% of African American women, and I think for African American men, the amounts are even lower. But we saw these closure of mental health facilities when people were actually going through these crises, because one of the things we have to understand is that um, in the Jewish community, we talk about this interwoven thing around the Holocaust and how people live, that even though they have not experienced the Holocaust, they still, because it's interwoven into their DNA now, they still feel the effects of what the Holocaust, how it played out on their ancestors. So we have to think about what happened to African Americans and what is currently happening to African Americans as a direct result of being enslaved, how that is played out in their DNA, around how their response, physical, mental, or otherwise, to us coming into the communities talking about various topics that can be very hard for them. And then the opening of this whole prison industrial complex, which is another thing that we saw within that time. And then looking at the current trauma. So in our research, we have to understand the current trauma that's playing out in our communities. And one of them was this whole thing around this Affordable Care Act, which we still have not been able to adequately get African Americans signed up for. I think that, for under the Trump administration, part of that was the funding around the marketing, not being able to market those programs to communities in order for them to know that there was still a such thing as the Affordable Care Act available to them. The other thing that we saw was the Black Lives Matter movement, where we started to see these sparks of some of the things around the 60s of us needing to place more emphasis on people and the things that were happening within the community around policing, around housing, around the whole kind of environmental inequities. The other thing is life expectancy. And this slide has changed since I created it, but Black life expectancy has dropped from 75 to 70 years since 2016. So we've lost 5 years of life expectancy in our community. So we have to remember that when we're seeking to engage them, is that this has been the lowest rate of life expectancy for African Americans since 2001. So understanding the role that COVID has also had on the communities, detrimental. When we're talking about scientific, the studies around COVID, I know that we have, quite a few that we're working on around COVID. I hope that they would actually do another study around African Americans who actually took some of the monoclonal drugs when they were diagnosed with COVID, and how it's playing out now. Because I'm one of those and I'm still a long hauler. And so I don't think I've seen any studies on that. I've seen studies around African American long haulers, but not African American long haulers who took some of the drugs in order for them to live. And so the detrimental impact is that the 2.9 times more likely than whites to be hospitalized, 1.9 times more likely to die. But the whole thing around African Americans, orphans, a lot of African American children were being raised by senior citizens. They were being raised by grandparents, aunts, or uncles. And so what we saw was this 2.4 times more likely for those children to be orphaned. Now, what will help happen with them within these systems? And how are we looking at what happens with them within the healthcare system, within them being able to get the care that they so desperately need, especially if they're now being put into these foster agencies. The other thing that's important to us in our research is this whole methodology around anti-racism in hospital settings. Like I talked about earlier, is that we've seen a lot of some of the past ills that had happened in hospital systems around racism, segregation coming to play. in our hospital systems now. And so we have to make sure that when we're doing studies and we're looking at particular dynamics and looking for particular communities, that we're doing everything that we can to make sure that those studies are as diverse as possible. I know that large part of like the Recover study has been having problems bringing in a large contingent of African Americans. And I think that a big part of that is that they're not working with a number of the community health centers. A lot of them are hospital focused. And so the community health centers that people normally go in for their care are kind of being left behind, but that is a way for us to engage communities that are disproportionately impacted. The other thing that's important for us around current trauma is this menthol restrictions. We have been working around menthol legislation, the whole role around menthol and COVID. We had this whole misnomer during COVID that if you smoked, you would not get COVID. And that is something that has followed our community. And so it is important for us to make sure that we're talking with the community around being targeted for death around tobacco corporations and what has happened with those corporations. Like those corporations have deliberately targeted the African American communities. Tobacco corporations was one of the first ones to hire African Americans in executive positions, but they also looked at the mass targeting of African Americans, targeting jazz concerts, the Newport Jazz Fest, the Cool Jazz Fest, or all cigarettes. And so using those, being strategic and manipulative around those communities and feeding them poison and understanding the role of menthol. So menthol by itself is okay, but menthol within cigarettes, that whole cool, minty, fresh feeling that people get allows them to take in more of the poison deeper into their lungs, which is highly addictive. And so what we have been seeing is across the country, even with the FDA doing a ban on menthol and then looking for other restrictions here locally. Those things are going to be important to our upcoming research. How do we research around the restrictions? How do we make sure that that cessation programs are available? How do we make sure that we're talking with people about access in hospitals, the role of COVID? COVID has not gone anywhere. And then looking at long COVID, what is the impact on children that were diagnosed with COVID? For adults who have brain fog, are we also seeing the same thing in children? Are they not being able to recall lessons that they learned from last semester as a direct result of having brain fog? I think that that's one of the things that we have not looked at. So our issue for us is that African Americans have been plagued with persistent race-based disparities that have existed for centuries, and this has impacted their health compared to their white counterparts in the population as a whole. Let's see. I'm reading off of two screens, y'all. And that racism medicine and the health parity for African Americans, in 2002, the National Medical Association produced this report called the Slave Health Deficit. It talked about racism in medicine and how it has operated at institutional, intellectual, policy, and personal levels, and that it is deeply ingrained in the fabric of the United States. That's important for research. That's important for us to understand that when we're talking about African Americans and research, we have to understand the role that racism has played in medicine and how deeply ingrained it is when we're seeking to get people to willingly participate in different kinds of things that we're doing. And to eliminate persistent race-based disparities, the U.S. must implement dramatic changes in policies that hide the structure, the functioning, and the financing of the healthcare system. It must direct their efforts to produce a system and a workforce that is culturally competent in dealing with African Americans. And I take that a little bit further to say that those workforces must also be culturally proficient, because cultural competency is around these systems. Do systems actually do what they're supposed to be doing? But when you talk about proficiency, do we understand what's going on with people in the communities that we're seeking to serve? And I think that is a big part of the research question is, do we understand fully the communities that we are seeking to engage with and why they will or won't engage with us? The restitution To eliminate persistent disparities in the U.S., the U.S. must implement dramatic changes in all policies. For us, this is important because all policies should include a reparations lens. So when we have research studies, we should be making sure that people are being paid for their time. So that means that if we are coming into communities and asking the communities for their time, we should not be providing turkey sandwiches or pizza to communities that already have issues around hypertension, diabetes, and other things. We should be providing them with the dollars in order for them to provide the things that they need. So if you are doing a research study and it does not have an economic reprisal for communities included, you should not be doing that study. So you should be making sure that people who are subject to research are being paid. So when we do surveys or focus groups for the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, we compensate everybody. So if they're doing a survey, we compensate them for their time. If they're doing if they're doing a focus group, we compensate them for their time because their time is valuable and their time is money. And so we have to understand their time is not in turkey sandwiches and other pizza parties and all that other garbage anymore. That we have to understand that in order for us to be looked at as a viable way to engage the communities, we have to make sure that we're doing it the right way. And the right way is the restitution. All policy is health policy. So if you're doing research around education, if you're doing it around education, employment, and or housing, or health or healthcare, all policy is health policy. Because if people don't get the right education, if they're not inadequately educated, what's going to happen is you're going to see them with all kinds of chronic issues on the health side. The same around housing. When we're looking at inadequacies in housing, lead poisoning, radon, some of the other things that are disproportionately impacting poor Black and brown communities. We have to make sure that we're looking at changes in our policy, or that when we're writing these research proposals, that we're looking at health policy as the end goal. Like, how do we make sure that we're helping these people forever? Like, what can we do not only now, but what can we do to save people from generations to come? And then we have to direct efforts to produce a system and a workforce that are culturally proficient in dealing with African Americans. We have to make sure that we're hiring people who are working in these research studies from these communities. We have lots of African American community members that can be trained to do different types of work. And so we have to be willing to make sure that we are not bringing in research studies that are all white into Black communities, and that Black community, and then we're saying, okay, well, here we are, and Black people are looking at it and saying, there's not anybody that even looks like me as part of the study. And so what would make them want to participate? I wouldn't want to participate. But the big part around this whole thing around restitution is structural racism and examining these systems. So we have to be willing to understand that in research, we have to look at the systems that we have. And the systems that we have are built on racism. Whether we're talking about our environmental systems around our air, our water, our land, whether we're talking about our current policies, transportation, housing, our employment, our economics, our health, our food, and our education systems. We have to talk about what happens to those communities that are decimated by the impact of racism. Because remember, we said that racism is ingrained. The study said that racism is ingrained in the fabric of the United States culture. So we can't do a study, and the study never talks about racism. We cannot do a study with the African American community or with brown communities and never mention the word racism, because somebody's going to call us out on it and say, okay, hold on. What are you talking about? You're not even talking about the issues that are disproportionately impacting me. And then this case for equity. Health equity is achieved when every person has the opportunity to attain his or her full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. That's important, because that's what equity looks like. And so when we have these offices that say we have these DE&I people who are now new to these organizations, and none of the DE&I people look like the communities that we're trying to do DE&I work in. That's a problem. That's, yeah, very problematic. And I see that so often, not only here in Cleveland, but across the country as I'm speaking, and I speak everywhere. And so when I go into it, I call it out, because I think that that's part of the things around racism, is that we don't value the community enough to hire people to talk to about the community that look like the community. I'm like, I just don't get it. And then this whole thing around cumulative impact, you're going to see this more and more in your research that you're doing, because of this influx of dollars that's going to be coming from the EPA. So there are research studies that are going to be happening all over that focus on cumulative impact. Cumulative impact is important to us because in everyday life, some people are exposed to numerous pollutants from a wide variety of sources through multiple media pathways. Chemical stressors and environmental media, including the air, the water, and the land. Remember, I talked about the racism involved around the access to air, water, and land. And non-chemical stressors, including the social determinants of health. Researching and these social determinants, we always talk about these upstream and downstream. So we have to understand what cumulative impact plays into those. And then we have to understand around extreme weather conditions. Some of the things that we've been seeing here in the North, here in the South, these whole weather patterns and how they're impacting food, how they're impacting the communities that are living in them, how they're impacting people who are asthmatics, and who already have these extreme health conditions already. And so now you're talking about, places where all of a sudden, the weather went from, normally, our highs around this time of year are 40 degrees, and lately they've been 80 degrees. Just think about here. Yesterday it was like 70 degrees here. I was in Alabama last week and it was 30 degrees, like my first 3 days there. And then when I got ready to leave, it was 90 degrees. And so we're going to see that. And so how it plays out in research and in communities is important, because we have to do a direct response. We cannot wait until the emergency happens to say we have to have research and studies to figure out what needs to happen in these communities. We have to do these things beforehand. So cumulative impact and looking at the built natural and social environments affecting individuals and communities in both positive and negative ways. These are referred to as our cumulative impacts. And if you've never heard that statement before today, like I said, you're going to hear it a lot, because when the EPA puts out $500 million around environmental issues around air, water, and land, you better know what cumulative impact is and how it plays out in the communities that you're seeking to research. In communities, particularly those already overburdened, disproportionate impacts can arise from unequal environmental conditions and exposure to multiple stressors. Additionally, changes in environment can exacerbate many of these disproportionate impacts. So stuff that's already going on is going to be worse. So stuff that's there is worse. Sound like COVID? COVID played ping pong with communities. It just was like boom, 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 just bouncing off of stuff that was already there. And what we've seen now is this whole thing around the 6 months after COVID, how many people have died or are dying from heart attacks and strokes. How many people are now being diagnosed with diabetes that didn't have diabetes before COVID? And so I talked about it early. COVID is going to be with us for a long time. The impact of COVID is not going anywhere. So the research around COVID shouldn't go anywhere. We should be looking at COVID and saying, how do we make sure that we're doing everything possible to make sure that what happened to our communities during COVID, that we are able to use research to create policies to help stabilize these communities that are disproportionately impacted. And then finally, my last slide, because I was only supposed to have 4. Jaleesa, I'm trying to stick with your mandate. So is that the United States government, as part of this Kerner Commission report, and I always talk about the Kerner Commission report and why that report issued on February the 29th, 1968 is so vitally important. That report talked about every single facet of African American life. It talked about our policing, it talked about our schools, it talked about our housing, it talked about our educational systems, all of these systems that are just in total disarray that all lead to chronic health conditions. And so what this report said before they shelved it and said, we're not doing shiggity that this report said. The report said, and this is from the United States government and not from Ivanka Hall, what white Americans can never fully understand, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. In other words, white institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. Dr. King, the report was issued a couple months before his death, before his assassination. One of the things that he said, that if we actually followed the things on the report, that the report is a prescription that we were dying, and the report is now a prescription for life. And so looking at history, that's why it's important for me to talk about these pieces, looking at history and how it impacts these communities, and saying, through our historical perspective, we have to make sure that in research, we are looking at racism, the role of racism, that we're looking at research and research participants, particularly African American communities, and how they're disproportionately impacted, that we're looking at resilience, and what has been the resilience of those communities, and that we're looking at restitution, that we should always be looking at all of these things through an equity lens, and making sure that we can do everything that we can to make sure that the community does not feel like they're being researched to death, and that research is this timeline that comes 1 to 3 years, and that it goes away, and that everything, you put a Band-Aid over a bullet wound, and then in 3 years you snatch it off, and then I start profusely bleeding again, and then you try to figure out what the next research wave is, while we've never actually did anything about the first one. But we have to make sure that in all that we're doing, that we're making sure that we're keeping the community in the back of our minds, and then how do we get to equity? And so, many of the people that I work with, or that I've talked to across the country, cannot spell equity, if they wanted to. They talk about equity all the time, but in actuality, they're not doing anything about equity. Because if you really want to do equity, you have to make sure that all of these things, whether we're talking about how to address education, employment, housing, and health, whether we're talking about these cumulative impacts, that all of these things have to be included. Like, we cannot work in silos. We have to make sure that when we're working with communities, that we're understanding all of the dynamics that play out, and that understanding that the African American church is not the cure-all end-all. A lot of times what happens in research is we run to the African American church first because we're like, oh, they have access to African Americans. But we pass the 300 Black boys that are standing on the corner before we get to the church, that will have never seen a church and aren't ever going into a church. The time they're going to go into a church is when one of their friends die, because their mama is going to have the service at the church, and then they're never going to be at a church again. And so we have to make sure that we're not forgetting people and leaving people behind, that can benefit from the studies, or from the focus groups, or from all of the other work that we're doing, when we're supposed to be looking at equity. And I think that is it. Jaleese, did I do okay on time? I hope so.
Yeah, you're perfect. So we have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone wants to type it in the chat or come off mute, we can kick things off, though, talking a little bit about translation and what we do at the Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative. So, Ivanka, the process of translation being taking those observations from the lab, clinic, and community, turning them into interventions that improve the health of individuals in the public. And I absolutely love the way that you've woven the importance of how research has the responsibility of being developed in a way that includes diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility from the start, so that when it does inform policy, those policies reflect all of the things that we need and want them to do. So what opportunities do you see for advancement of equity through translation, using that definition that's from the national, from NCATS? What, if you had to put it in a nutshell, what opportunities do you see for equity through translation in our Black and African American community?
So I think that, one of the slides when I talked about resilience and restitution, I think that for our communities to make sure that we're working with very resilient communities. Like through all of this, they have survived. So all of the things that we're talking about and the internalized, these structures that are built, like these are the structures that they have to go through, maneuver through every single day. And so we have to make sure that our whatever we're doing around our translational research is not so academic that we forget people, that we forget community. And so I think that that's one of the things that happened in the past. Like, I'm not being funny. When I talk about turkey and pizza, I'm pissed because what I would see is I would see researchers come into the community, and the first thing that they would say is, we're going to give you a pizza party. I'm like, well, hell, they shouldn't even be eating pizza in the first place. Or we're going to give you a turkey sandwich. You mean with all that damn sodium and some white bread? Like, really? Do you think that you should be giving that to African American communities that that have diabetes, that have hypertension, that have like all of these other chronic conditions? Like, and so part of that whole thing is we have to make sure that we're making whatever process that we have, that we're not making it so cumbersome that the community is looking at it and saying, oh, I'm not included in this, I'm not going to participate. And I think that that's one of the things that I have had problems with, and I'm being transparent around Recover. I get on there and complain all the time because I just don't think that that they're listening to community members. Community members get on here, and they say, these are some things, these are some gaps. So if the community member is telling you it's a gap, there's a gap because they know the community better than anybody else. And so on the other side, they're going, well, that's not really what we're seeing. And then the community member, I don't really care what you're seeing. What I'm telling you is, that there's a gap. And so I think that because we are so based on the science that we forget about the personal. And I think that that's why I go back and talk about being culturally proficient, because the science says cultural competency, but the personal says you need to be proficient. You need to understand those communities, the ebbs and flows of those communities before you go in and implement a process. And then even including them on the beginning end. So before you start off the process, going into the community and saying, what seems to be the problem? Back in the day, I used to call it this whole drive-by research term. So we drive by communities and we look over the house and we're like, oh, your house is peeling, your paint, it's falling in. Oh, you're so poor, you can't even afford to fix your house. And we go back to the office. We never even knock on the door to talk to the homeowner. And we say, oh, we brought people back to fix your house, because, you can't afford to get it fixed. And the homeowner says, well, I have the money to get it fixed. I just can't find the workers. And we're like, oh, well, we didn't think you had the money. And it's like, well, you didn't even talk to them about the money. You saw something and you didn't go in to dig down and to say to the community, so what do you need? What are some of the things that are going on with you? And then how do we best get to this whole piece around engagement? How are we making sure that we're doing the things that we're supposed to do? And why health disparities are everyone's problem, and it's everyone has to be included in the solution.
Absolutely. Tashiana, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. So hi, thank you for your insight. I think it's so useful for everyone. So I'm a member of a research team, and I just wanted to know if you had any suggestions or recommendations for research teams in engaging the community when it comes to disseminating the data and the findings that we collect.
Yeah, let me escape out of this, and then maybe we can go back to how do I go to not to share the screen anymore? So, okay, thank you. So could you repeat that again? You said you were a member of the research team.
Yeah, I'm a member of a research team, and I just wanted to know if you had any suggestions or recommendations for research teams in engaging the community in disseminating data and findings that we collect or that we see.
Wow, I think that first off, hopefully, you know, when you started doing the data collection, that the community was included at the beginning. And then that way it's easier for you to go back, because, you know, the other thing about the community is this whole trust factor. Who do they trust and why? And so if you have been transparent and come into the community and said, okay, well, we're collecting data, and when we get finished, we're gonna come back and bring that information to you, then you can host the same kind of listening session and just do it on like the data dissemination and come back and say, look, we promise you we're coming back and tell you what we found, which never happens. And so now we're back to tell you what we've been doing for the last 2 years or 3 years, and like this is the results. And then, you know, talk with them about like what are some of the best things that could happen with those results. And like for me, I think that all of it should include some policy. Some policy change should happen. Like you should not be doing research on a community and a policy doesn't come back on how to make it better. You know, like it should be something that's a policy objective that says the policy says this needs to change and we need to go talk to city council about changing it. But I think that part of that is that trust factor, making sure that you have a diverse representation on your study team, and then making sure that you include the community from the onset is going to be vitally important to you coming back. Not only coming back again with something else, with another study, but for you coming back with a solution. Because if you come back and you present your information to that community, they know you didn't forget them. They know you didn't come in and get the information and then you never hear from them again. And so for them, that means everything. And so guess what? They're going to trust you. So when you get ready to come back the next time, they're going to say, yeah, we remembered you. You actually came back and told us what you found from the first time. So I think that is going to be something for you all. One of the suggestions or a couple of suggestions that'll help you in your work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Ivanka, and everyone who's in attendance. So much great information. We really appreciate you, your time and expertise. So what is next? We have our next READI Special Populations Roundtable talk with Dr. Rick Kittles. He's the Senior Vice President for Research and Professor of Community Health and Preventive Medicine at the Morehouse School of Medicine. He'll be talking with us on Zoom from noon to 1 on March 24th. And since you're registered for this, you're already registered for this series. He'll be focusing on ancestry and health disparities. What can you do today? You can schedule a READI consultation at spark.case.edu. You can sign up to attend future programming and join our listserv and review CTSC DEIA resources on our website. And there's our website address right there, case.edu. And you can follow us. We're constantly uploading things on LinkedIn. We'd love to connect with you. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.